Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the Council of the Americas for what promises to be a fascinating conversation with some true experts on some issues that are facing all of us in the Western Hemisphere, namely the impact and implications of authoritarian capital in the Americas. In other words, what does it mean? In my view, the entrance of China specifically into the Western Hemisphere this century has been perhaps the most significant change in hemispheric politics that we have seen. And that takes account of issues like Chavismo in Venezuela or some of the economic and financial crises the region has faced. But this is a long-term and significant shift in the regional power dynamic and economic dynamic, and we need to understand what it means, both the positives and the negatives, and where it might be headed in terms of development for the region, and not to say as well the implications for democracy itself. We have a fantastic panel discussion that will be discussing these issues later on in the program. But before we get to them, we have two important presentations to make. The first is my own. I'm Eric Farnsworth with the Council, and we are releasing today the results of a two-year project that we've run, which explores the implications of authoritarian capital in the Western Hemisphere. That report is linked to this Zoom session, and you can have access to it in both English and Spanish. And we would be delighted to get it to you. If you can't somehow pull it down this morning, we also have hard copies, and we can get it to you without much trouble at all. And the second presentation, of course, is going to be from Bethany Allen-Ebrahimian, who has just published or just written a book that was published on these issues, and I'll get to her really important discussion in a moment. But first, the highlights of the Council of the Americas report, which again was the product of 2 years of consultations. This is a report that takes account of business practices in the region, which had discussions and highlighted the important views of business people in the region with real pragmatic experience, on-the-ground experience, also keen observers of the region, government officials, and others, people who are genuinely seeking to understand what's at stake, but equally importantly, how has it changed the way business is done? How has it changed the way governments look at the world? And how has it changed some of the things that the people of the region are facing as well? This report came up with several key findings. This is not an academic report. It's highly accessible to a wider audience, intentionally so. And some of the key findings that we have developed would be that, first of all, China's engagement in the region is here to stay. The Chinese are here, as are many others, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. The region is open for business, and that's a very good thing. And so China is very well established in the region, and relations are increasingly intertwined. We also know, however, that there are broader implications besides just an economic agenda, and that the economic agenda, which is very real, is also being utilized for a broader political agenda that serves Chinese interests, to be sure. Does it serve Latin America's interests? I think that question is open for debate. What we have found and what we are suggesting is that there are some downside implications for democracy for the region, and we call your attention to some of those specific things in the report. We also suggest that appreciation is lagging in terms of what people understand to be really the main issues here. That there is a top-line understanding that there's a lot of money involved, but there isn't necessarily a deeper understanding of what does it mean? What is the true cost of authoritarian capital? And that's something that we suggest education and understanding needs to be increased throughout the region as well. But it's not necessarily easy because misinformation is also persistent. Misinformation through new tools, such as social media or state-sponsored media practices, etc., which perhaps are supporting a vision that's not necessarily or entirely accurate about what are the implications. And so that misinformation also has to be somehow cut through to get to the real truth. And, you know, coming from Washington as I am, one of the key points that we always seek to make, but it's particularly relevant to the current circumstances, is that the agenda from Washington for the Americas really needs to be much more robust. It's one thing to ask our friends and allies, and even folks who aren't our friends and allies, to take a skeptical view of authoritarian capital in terms of what it might mean in their own economies. But the obvious rejoinder is, well, fine, but we need money, we need development, we need certain things. What do you have to offer? And I think that's a question that we increasingly hear, and it's something that we are certainly urging the United States and other interested countries in Europe, Canada, etc., to really take a more strategic view of the Western Hemisphere, to understand that this is a region that is in play, that there's much at stake, and issues like, for example, global energy transition simply cannot occur without Latin America and the Caribbean being centered as part of that discussion. So if there was ever a view that the region really may not have mattered that much on the economic side, well, that's old think, because to get to where we need to go globally, the Western Hemisphere has to be part of that discussion and part of that consideration. China understands that. The question is, do we? And so that is something that we have also highlighted in our report. One of the specific things we are suggesting is that the trade agenda must be re-energized and re-engineered to be more effective and to offer not just a counterweight, but to offer real opportunities for the region in a way that they will find attractive, so that perhaps the temptation of authoritarian capital is less and less. Again, I call your attention to the report, Chinese Capital in Latin America and the Caribbean. We won't charge you for it either. It's free of charge. So we call that to your attention and ask for your indulgence there. It's my real privilege to have the opportunity to welcome to the Council of the Americas, as I mentioned, the author of the new book, Beijing Rules, Bethany Allen-Ebrahimian. Bethany is joining us, I believe, from Taipei, Taiwan, but certainly someplace with a different, not just zip code, but time zone from where we are, and is joining us probably in the middle of the night. But Bethany, what a privilege it is to have you here with us. For those who don't know, Bethany's book is about ways and implications and the strategic approach that China has taken in terms of building its own influence throughout the world, specifically emerging markets. So it's not specifically focused on the Western Hemisphere, but we do find similarities certainly and practices that are shared across the world. And Bethany, I hope that's a fair rendering of your writing. I don't want to steal your thunder, but I do want to just frame the comments accurately and fairly. But it is being very well received and reviewed to the point where some people are even calling the work seminal. So this is something that we need to be aware of and take account of, and it's our privilege to have the author of Beijing Rules here to join us. And what we've asked Bethany to do is to overview the main points of her book, and then we'll have a short conversation. And then at the conclusion of that, then we will introduce our expert panel and continue our conversation. Bethany, thanks for joining us, and over to you for your key points about Beijing Rules.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Eric, and thank you so much for having me today. It's really my pleasure to join this discussion, and I'm looking forward to hearing from the other panelists a little bit later on. My book, Beijing Rules, is centered around a concept that I call authoritarian economic statecraft. economic statecraft, of course, is the use of economic power to achieve geopolitical goals. So we're not talking about, trade wars here. It's something to achieve geopolitical goals. And I've affixed the word authoritarian to it to specify that, to show how China is using its economy in this way. And what I mean by China's authoritarian economic statecraft is the quite innovative ways, in fact, that the Chinese Communist Party has created to control access to its markets and its capital in order to shape the behavior and decision-making of governments, companies, multilateral institutions, and individuals around the world. And how we see that is in several different ways. And first, I'll talk about the implications of trade. So there's been numerous examples over the past 10 to 15 years of the way that the Chinese government will close off access to its markets for products coming in order to punish governments or sectors or companies for specific behavior that crosses Chinese Communist Party core interests. An early example of this was with Norway, when the Nobel Prize Committee awarded the Nobel Peace Prize to Liu Xiaobo in 2010. Now, of course, the Nobel Prize Committee is not a Norwegian government committee, but the Chinese government still effectively blocked all imports of Norwegian salmon to China. And that was really significant for Norwegian salmon exporters because China is by far their biggest market. And those salmon imports were blocked until 2016, when the Norwegian government offered an olive branch to Beijing, and they reestablished normal diplomatic relations. And the Norwegian government said publicly that they would avoid doing anything that infringed upon China's sovereignty and core interests in the future. So that was, very clearly an effective way to get the attention of Norway and to say, look, you can't, we don't want you as a country to criticize our human rights record or anything like that. But we also see the use of this sort of weaponization of access to China's markets and its capital for many other purposes as well, not just to stymie criticism of its domestic human rights record, but also to shape defense decisions that governments make. An example of that would be South Korea in 2016, 2017, when South Korea agreed to, when they deployed a US-made missile defense system known as THAAD. The reason they did that, of course, was to increase their defense capabilities against North Korea. But that missile defense system, extends theoretically into China's territory. And so Beijing was very unhappy with it and launched, again, an unofficial, but very, very clearly, but a very clear campaign of a multi-pronged campaign of economic coercion against South Korea. Chinese tourists no longer went to South Korea. K-pop stars were not allowed into China to perform their concerts. K-pop music stopped being streamed from Chinese websites. A South Korean retail store, Lotte, had major projects in China that were just suddenly suspended. These are some more examples. And we also see this kind of economic statecraft deployed to further isolate Taiwan on the international stage and to shut down discussion of the Tiananmen massacre in 1989, criticism of China's policies in Tibet. But the interesting thing is that the Chinese Communist Party's core interests are the things that the government has used economic coercion to try to achieve. But what is considered the CCP's core interests has expanded over time, and especially in recent years. And the pandemic was a very good example of that, because at the beginning of the pandemic, the Chinese government began to deploy some of these methods of coercion and covert influence and disinformation around the discussion about the origins of the coronavirus pandemic, and Beijing began to view discussion of the fact that the pandemic originated in China effectively as a new core interest. And so we saw major moves by the Chinese government to try to shut down basic scientific debate and inquiry into the pandemic. And an example of this would be with Australia. In April 2020, then Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison, called for an independent inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus. And almost immediately, the Chinese government slapped a lot of tariffs on a wide swath of Australian exports to China, including coal, barley, wine, and other products. And what was interesting about this was that it was done so almost transparently. Shortly before that was, before those tariffs were put onto Australian products, the Chinese ambassador to Australia said, "We think that Scott Morrison's call, for the investigation into the coronavirus origins is going to upset Chinese people. They're probably going to stop eating Australian beef." Trying to make it seem as though perhaps this was an organic nationalism in China, when in fact it was a government policy. So these are all forms of economic coercion, which is kind of the stick side of it. But there's also a carrot side. And that's where initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative come in. And what we've seen over the past 10 years since the BRI began is that the Chinese government, in the name of no strings attached, win-win cooperation, has gone and greatly strengthened its diplomatic network around the world by offering infrastructure loans and construction deals to many developing countries and emerging economies. But as we have very clearly come to see, there are strings attached, but they look different than development aid and assistance from the West, which has certain kind of, if you will, ethical and moral and due diligence requirements. The Chinese government, on the other hand, requires that companies and governments help the Chinese government or submit to their requests, political requests as needed. And here's a really good example of that. In 2020, when the Chinese government had pushed its very authoritarian national security law onto Hong Kong, which was an abrogation of the 1984 Sino-British Agreement, there was a letter that was signed by 20 some odd countries and sent to the UN Human Rights Commission, condemning this very authoritarian law. And the countries that signed it, of the countries that signed that letter, none of them had signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative. Very soon thereafter, there was another letter that was sent to the UN Human Rights Commission, signed by 30 some odd countries, praising China's policies in Hong Kong. And of the countries that signed on to that letter, all of them had signed on to the BRI or had some kind of BRI-related memorandum of understanding with China. So you can see how it's a very clear, almost like a budding sphere of influence, to have these countries that are dependent upon China economically in terms of their debt and these deals with Chinese state-owned companies, that they're willing to stand up for China's authoritarianism, or they have to stand up for China's authoritarianism on the international stage. And what does that look like domestically? When a country has lots of Chinese state-owned enterprises coming in, has signed deals with the Chinese government, maybe trade deals in addition to the loans and infrastructure deals. What very clearly happened is a range of things. First of all, the government of that country knows that those deals can be canceled at any moment, and that would be very detrimental to them. So they give away a degree of sovereignty. And second is that these projects, the government can't speak freely about whether or not they're actually good. Oftentimes, local media is not free or is not developed enough to be able to do investigative journalism about it. And due to corruption and other other problems, the projects themselves may not be high quality. So it isn't even necessarily bringing all of the benefits to the local people that maybe it seemed like it would have, or that it would have promised. And then third is that there are human rights concerns of various kinds that come in with this. And one of them is that if there's technology involved, that the Chinese government may be using some of this for espionage or surveillance, or maybe bringing in their own authoritarian surveillance systems for use by the local governments against their own people. So these are some of the major concerns. And I want to now talk very briefly about some very recent reporting I did this year in Tanzania. And this touches on, what can we do about China's authoritarian economic statecraft? What can countries do to help push back against this, the authoritarian pressure that governments are feeling? Tanzania is an interesting case because it has a close relationship with China, but it also has a long-standing, close development relationship with a lot of countries, with Denmark, with the United States, with Germany, for example. It's, Tanzania is part of the non-alignment movement, so it's always tried to maintain those ties. And what we see in Tanzania is that, yes, Tanzania is close to the Chinese Communist Party, but because they have multiple relationships, long-standing relationships, they have choice to some extent when it comes to the projects that they sign on to. And there's a really good example, a concrete example of this, and that is the Bagamoyo port. Around 2017 or 2018, Tanzania signed an agreement with China for them to build a deep sea port in Bagamoyo. But what was not known publicly at the time were the terms of that agreement. And the terms of that agreement were basically very similar to what we saw in Sri Lanka, which is that the whole port and the region around it were going to be leased to China for 99 years. And in addition to that, there were two other cities in Tanzania, port cities, that were not developed yet. The ports were not developed, but the Chinese government was saying that Tanzania had to give up the right to even develop their own cities so that China could develop them in the future. And in 2019, Tanzanian President Magufuli came out against this agreement, and he made the terms of it public, and he called it exploitation, and he suspended it. And now Tanzania is in negotiations with a couple of Gulf states, I think United Arab Emirates, and maybe, I can't remember the other partner, trying to see who can build Bagamoyo port. Now, those are still authoritarian states. It's still authoritarian capital. But at least Tanzania has some degree now of agency and has better choices to preserve its own sovereignty. And, and the fact of the matter is that, democratic nations are just not as concerned about the global influence of the United Arab Emirates the way that we are about China. So the moral of the story here is that for developed nations, the ones that do provide development assistance, that do partner with countries and trade with emerging economies, to stay engaged and to stay as engaged as possible so that they can continue to be a player there and provide choice and agency to the local governments.
Bethany, thank you very much for that. Well, first of all, I need to tell people who you are. I neglected to do that, and I apologize. Bethany Allen-Ebrahimian is the China reporter for Axios. She's the author of Beijing Rules: How China Weaponized Its Economy to Confront the World, which has been listed by the Financial Times as one of the 15 best business books of 2023. That's pretty high praise, but as I say, well deserved. And for those of you who are interested in more about her background, as well as the biographic information of the panelists who will be speaking shortly, that's all also available on this Zoom link. Bethany, you mentioned something that made my ears perk. Well, you mentioned a lot of things that made my ears perk up, but one phrase in particular with the Tanzania example, you were talking about the leader made the terms public. What's the role of secrecy in some of these agreements that China forces some of these countries to sign, and how does that impact some of the issues you're talking about?
Yes, exactly. So it is more often the case than not that agreements between local, governments and the Chinese government or Chinese state-owned enterprises, whoever that direct, intermediary may be, are not made public, are just completely secret, and that is really concerning because first and foremost, it prevents the residents and the citizens of that country from having any say. If they don't know what the terms are, they can't be opposed to them. They can't go out and protest against them. They have no right and no say over what is happening in their own country, whether that be a road that's getting built or a mine that's going to be, used, or a port, or a kind of technology that is being imported by their government. They don't know. And also, when these terms are not made public, it can also, so in the Tanzania example, and this was also true of Kenya, by the way, it's a very similar issue in Kenya, is that sometimes these contracts are not fair. They're very clearly exploitative. And what I find so ironic about the Sri Lanka case and also the Bagamoyo port one is that one of the Chinese government's, really huge and long-standing resentments towards the West and towards Britain in particular was that Hong Kong was leased to Britain for like 150 years. And, Beijing views this as just a terrible example of colonialism. And yet they're doing almost exactly the same thing in these much, much less powerful and less developed countries. And a third concern about the lack of transparency is that on a global scale, it makes it very difficult to do research about the Belt and Road Initiative or about the Chinese government's other development and construction projects around the world. And so it's really hard to understand trends. How much money? What are the terms usually like? What are the results? Are they actually achieving what they said they were going to achieve? On average, what do governments feel like they're losing sovereignty or not? It's very hard to make these kinds of to do basic research into it. And that's very bad for the whole global community.
Yeah, absolutely right. And we've seen some of these trends also in the region. We're most focused on Latin America and the Caribbean. We're going to hear about that very shortly. So these are some very, very important points. Just very quickly, because we don't have a whole lot of time left for this segment, but you also mentioned something that requires a longer discussion. We won't be able to have the chance to get to it, but the idea that when countries incorporate some of the technology that originates in China, they're opening up their own economies to a lot more than just telephone services or 5G technology. No, tell us a little bit about what that risk looks like.
Absolutely. So there's concerns about so-called smart cities technology. So this is the idea. It's an interesting idea that if you have enough surveillance cameras and if you have enough sensors and you can gather data and use that to govern more effectively. And so a very basic example would be something like having sensors that automatically know the number of cars at an intersection at any given time. And that can help governments make better decisions about new roads that need to be made or how to do the stoplights and this kind of thing. But this, anytime you're talking about massive deployment of surveillance cameras, this is or mass collection of data on a population, there's very obvious room for abuse there. And the systems that the Chinese government is exporting as a part of a smart cities package, and also just separate from smart cities, but just that generally idea, are systems that inside of China have been used very obviously for repression of large scale repression of populations, whether in Xinjiang or in mainland the cities more in the main part of China. So that's an enormous concern.
Yeah, absolutely. And it brings up the obvious question, why is China doing some of these things? Is it for development of the of emerging markets, or is it for Chinese core interests, or even more specifically, the core interests of the Chinese Communist Party? I'm going to leave that question pregnant because we do have a terrific panel that we need to get to. But Bethany, this is terrific. You've really given us a lot to think about, even in a very short period of time. Once again, I call the attention of our audience to Beijing Rules. It is a fantastic book and something that is going to open your eyes if you haven't been following these issues closely. Bethany, I hope you'll stay on, but for now, thank you. And this has been a great way to launch our program today.
Thanks so much, Eric.
We're going to turn now to our panel, which does include three former senior government leaders from Latin America who are also deeply involved in business affairs as well as observing trends in the region. Jorge Tuto Quiroga is the former president of Bolivia. Julio Guzman is a former National Endowment for Democracy fellow, and he is the founder of Peru's Partido Morado. And Mariano Federici is the senior managing director of K2 Integrity, but he is also the former head of Argentina's Financial Intelligence Unit. We'll get to them in a second. President Quiroga is on screen. And Mr. President, Tuto, if I may, you've heard from the global perspective Bethany's commentary about what China is doing elsewhere, Africa, et cetera. Is that what you're seeing in Latin America too? Are those trends evident? Are they different? What are you seeing, and what are the implications of authoritarian capital in Latin America?
Well, thank you, Eric, and thanks to the Council of Americas. Regards to Bethany and the fellow panelists, Julio, Mariano, the best to you. I'm not in La Paz. I'm in London for some conferences, so I cannot say that I'm sitting at home in La Paz, in the only city in the world where Messi, the greatest player ever, has been 4 times and never scored a goal because of our high altitude. But I am here where all the great players have been bought by the European teams in soccer. I haven't really seen Bethany's book. I'm familiar with some of the things she mentioned. The level of pressure exerted on Norway, the K-pop singers. I could mention the NBA, Australian wine, and what have you. But it's China is a major powerhouse, and powerhouses always use and exercise their muscle, whether it's the U.S. or Europe, taking away visas or making their stances known on ways that are somewhat beyond the pale many a times. But I like to focus more, Eric, on China and its role in Latin America, particularly South America, and provide a wake-up call, if you will, with what's happening on 4 fronts: trade, finance, lithium, and digital world. I will tell you the following. China is to South America, south of the Panama Canal world, more Chinese than U.S. because it is the #1 or #2 trade partner, commodity buyer for all our countries. Eric, you and I were sitting, I think, at the Brookings December 2015 on the Venezuela event, and you recall I called the 2004-2014 decade the Chicha decade. Yeah. Chinese economically and Chavista politically. We know how that turned out in Venezuela. So the eruption of China in South America has been there for a long time. And I will tell you what's very concerning right now. Yes, the China economy is slowing down a bit. But what is concerning right now is that the U.S. is not open for business vis-a-vis trade. It is impossible to get through the U.S. Congress a trade agreement like we had the NAFTA and its revamped version, or at some time the Central America agreements, Dominican Republic, Peru, Colombia, and what have you. There's a middle ground in the U.S. We used to have a middle ground where we had enough Democrats joining a majority of Republicans to open up to vote for trade agreements, and a majority of Democrats with some Republicans on migration treatment. Right now, there's a general consensus where in the U.S. Congress we do not want, they cannot get good treatment for our people or our products. And I would tell you that, Eric, is also happening in Europe. Mercosur, the south of South America, has negotiated with Europe since 1999. They signed an agreement in 2019. They cannot get it through because of French protectionism. And what we hear is China, watch out, Communist Party, single party state. Yes, we know. Trust me, I'm the last thing I'll be accused of being a communist. I've been kicked out of Venezuela twice and Cuba once. But I can tell you from South America's standpoint, the only country that is aggressively open for trade, not only with Pacific Rim countries, but also on the eastern side Atlantic, like Uruguay and Paraguay, is China. And the world should wake up when Santiago Peña, recently sworn in as president of Paraguay, says that by December, we do not get the European Union trade agreement. Finally, and after 25 years of dating and talking and signing, if we do not get it into motion, we will go negotiate with Asia, which is code for China. And coming from a president of a country that recognizes Taiwan, I ought to tell you something about the trade position of US and Europe and how close they're perceived to be. Second point, quickly on financing. Bethany, I understand the point she makes. We have lived through this cycle. I was a young vice minister of planning a long time ago and I would go to international funding institutions and say, please, no tide aid. Tide aid is what's unsavory and what creates the difficulties. Yes, we used to have a long time ago, US and Japan providing tide aid, concessional interest rates, long-term loans, subject to you purchasing the services or the infrastructure projects from American or Japanese contractors. They moved away from that, then that shifted to Europe. We repeated the same thing, tide aid, then to Brazil, Odebrecht, Lava Jato, because tide aid usually is overpriced stuff that can bring about corruption. Brazil and Lava Jato was the example. And China, we go through that cycle again. Tide aid predicated on them dictating who gets the contract for whatever you're building in any country, with lack of environmental and labor standards to boot. And it'd be interesting, as I made the point, Eric, that China is open for trade on aid and funding. China is part of the problem, because now on the Paris Club, where you go renegotiate bilateral debt, China is moved from the debtor to the creditor side, and they have to take haircuts on their aid. In Africa and Latin America, and it's a different position, and here they're more part of the problem than the solution. Having said that, it is difficult to see the IDB, Inter-American Development Bank, or the World Bank adding up the money to provide the funding post-COVID, when we all in South America, Latin America need foreign currency because of the COVID crisis and the difficulties that brought about. And the fact with the Federal Reserve jacking up interest rates, the Federal Reserve blower that was blowing money out the window is now sucking the money in. Currencies are being devalued. We need foreign currency, and China is part of the problem as a country that loaned us money that they don't take haircuts on, and we do not have enough funding on the World Bank and the IDB. Last, to close on lithium and the digital world. On lithium, there's 60% of the world's lithium is a triangle between my country, Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile. Guess who is refining 2/3 of the lithium, but not only 2/3 of the lithium. Every mineral that goes into a lithium battery. A lithium battery is like a tennis match. On one side, cobalt, nickel, manganese. It's maybe switching to iron phosphate, other technologies. But generally speaking, right now, it's cobalt, nickel, manganese on one side, graphite on the other. Lithium is the balls that go back and forth, charge, discharge. And China is refining between 66 to 95% of each of the minerals that I just mentioned on the functioning of the lithium battery. And they have a huge advantage on the EV cars, which, by the way, in the world of AI, they are roving studios with cameras capturing real-time data that will be fed into AI systems up ahead. And the AI models have already eaten and devoured all the text, and they're going to need food, so to speak, which will come from EV cars on the roads, and China is leading by a mile, or cell phone applications. And the thing that concerns me the most here is that the most popular social media application comes out of China, and it's TikTok, and it is our young people are using it, and it's becoming more and more influential in campaigns. And the reason I mention that is because there's a lot of talk about climate change in Europe and the US, but China is moving very swiftly and efficiently on solar, on wind, on EV cars, and to boot towards AI, EV cars, you add TikTok, and they seem to have an advantage. And my last word of caution on this is, as trade agreements get finalized between South American countries and China, do not forget that those contain in those agreements things like state procurement, intellectual property, and what have you. So in today's 21st century digital AI world, they will have an advantage if they build the links, because the US and Europe seem to be closed for business. And I understand, I've been to plenty of events, Eric, where we used to get US government officials, particularly in the Trump administration, with speaking talks, their Frank Sinatra imitation of Huawei, no way, out of the way. Well, show me the way in which we can engage on trade and funding with the US and Europe. And if that is not there, yes, China is available. And I, for one, live and will die by the democratic charter that we signed in Lima in 2001 that applies to Latin America. I cannot apply it to Azerbaijan, Qatar, or China. Over there, things like open trade and more funding will start prevailing. So just a word of caution on how the world is moving in that regard. Thank you, Eric.
Well, thank you for those brilliant comments. And you're exactly right. I mean, you know, it's hard to complain that somebody makes a choice if there is no choice, right? If there's no alternative, there's no alternative. It's something I've been, going on about for some time, and I really appreciate you highlighting those points, especially also the Mercosur negotiation that has gone on for, a generation at this point, 25 years. So, we're going to have to see some progress there, or something's going to change, no doubt. Tuto, thank you very much. Fantastic. We're going to go to Julio Guzman now. Julio, from the Peruvian context, Tuto mentioned the word corruption. You've kind of lived through some of those issues in terms of what China's tried to do in your home country of Peru. You want to tell us a little bit about that and how you're seeing some of these issues from your perspective, please?
Yes, absolutely. I want to start first. Thank you so much, Eric, and the Council of the Americas for the invitation, and congratulations to Bethany for publishing the book, and also to my fellow speakers today. Well, yes, absolutely. I've been witness as a public servant in Peru. I was Deputy Prime Minister, the Secretary General of the Office of the Prime Minister, and also President of the Cabinet of Vice Ministers. And I've been in direct contact with Chinese authorities. And this is one of the reasons why I focus now on China-Latin American relations and how we can counter out China's presence in the region. I always want to use the word digest in order to talk about China. I think that we need to digest China in the region, which means we need to take everything that is positive, investment, transmission of knowledge, but we need to reject all the things that go against our values and against our own institutions, including democracy. And in order to do that, we need to not to be naive. We need to be realistic, not to be on the extremes, be realistic. I really don't think that China's sharp power or hard power in using the asymmetric position that China has is the only damage to the region. I believe that the only natural practices of Chinese investment causes us many, many problems. Why Latin Americans, we allow corruption in Chinese investment? Because there is impunity. Why we allow that the public infrastructure projects just fall down and break after the Chinese companies build it? Why? Because our procurement systems are pretty old and they prioritize prices instead of quality. Why we allow that the labor standards and the protection of the environment also is not important for them? Because we don't have the institutional arrangement and the right regulations, and we don't have the human capital resources in the government to do that. So if you see all these problems that are coming with China, there is a common thing. And the common thing is that this is a problem of institutions. It's a problem of good governance. Economics, of course, is important. But in my opinion, the most important thing here is values and ideas, which institutions are formed by values and ideas. I don't think we're losing the war on economic growth. We are losing the war on ideas and values. That's why I always say that even though there are other policies that we need to apply, the most important one here is investing in people. If we do not invest in people's minds, in education, and trying to win the war of ideas, we are done here. Because this is a fight that is going to take us decades. This is not a thing that we're going to fix in 5 years. If we remember, the creation of the nation states many centuries ago was because of the era of the Enlightenment. And the illustration led to the liberal revolutions in the Americas and in Europe. So this is about ideas. It's not economic growth, particularly. I am an economist. I work in the Inter-American Development Bank as a trade economist, so don't misunderstood my words. What I'm saying is that if we do not invest in people, if we do not remind Latin Americans why democracy is important for their lives and for their children, if we do not remind Latin Americans that we belong to the same family tree in values with the United States, we are done here. We are done here. Aside from that, I think that it would be a very strategic mistake for us if we sit back and just relax because China is having problems in its economy. I'm here in Washington. I live in Washington for many years, but also in Latin America for many years. And one of the things that I noticed here in Washington is this bipolar characteristic of opinion here in Washington. When China is doing well, China is the biggest threat in the world. But when China is having some problems, China is no longer a problem. And I think we need to take a more responsible and mature way of seeing things. China is not getting into an economic crisis. China is not in a recession. What China is having in the structural way in which the economy is growing. That's it. What China needs to do is to rebalance the economy and trying to grow based on consumption of the families and based on productivity and technology. Why? Because it's the sustainable way that countries develop in the world. Countries do not grow long-term because of the state putting money on the economy. So we need to be very realistic about that. China is not going to collapse like the Soviet Union. China is a social market economy. The Soviet Union was a central planified economy. And finally, even if we acknowledge, even in that case, that China is having real big problems, well, we need to be afraid. Because when one country is in that situation, that is going to be more probabilities that Xi Jinping will be desperate and will take extreme measures. And that is going to be catastrophic for us. So my second thought is that we need to be smart, strategic, and don't think because China is having some problems in the way they are growing, it means that China is not a problem anymore. And that means that we need to take this in a very strategic way, trying to develop a strategic plan for Latin America, who doesn't exist right now. I did my homework. There is no single paper in the US government, official one, that is talking about a strategy to counter China in Latin America. This is one thing. And the other thing is, we need to be more ambitious, Eric. China is ambitious. The authoritarian guys, they are audacious. We don't. We just wait and we discuss and we analyze, but we don't go from analysis to action. Some people tell me that this is not because of lack of action, that this is because of the processes and our rules, because we are democracies. And in democracies, it takes time to talk and to make decisions. Well, I disagree. Why? Because if process and rules will be our problems in Washington, then the intensity of the discussion could be in Capitol Hill, discussing ideas, getting consensus about concrete policy actions, and that's because it's taking time. This is not happening, Eric, and you know that. What is lacking here is leadership. It's leadership and clarity about the risk of having Latin America be captured by authoritarianism again. Not only for United States national security, but for our own countries, And aside from the advices that I can give to engage again with Latin America, I just, as a parenthesis, I published a piece in Time magazine explaining 10 advices in order to engage in a renewed way, politically speaking, with Latin America. Aside from that, we need to be sure that we have the institutional arrangement in the West to deal with that strategy. Just having ideas about what to do with China in Latin America is not enough. We need to have the ways and the channels and the institutions in order to do that. And unfortunately, the institutions that we have now in the hemisphere are institutions that belong to the 20th century, to a world that doesn't exist. What we need here is not only having reforms within institutions like USAID, like the Inter-American Development Bank and the World Bank, and also having in the OAS, Organization for American States, but also coordination and cooperation among them. For instance, yesterday, the World Bank president acknowledged that in average, one project that the World Bank gives to the developing world, it takes 27 months in being approved. 27 months and takes 10 years in order to execute everything. In that way, with that procedures, we cannot deal with China. We need reforms, and we need three things. We need a political arm, which is the complete organization of organization of the American state that will serve us as a political platform to talk about that. Then we need a financial arm. And that financial arm is the Inter-American Development Bank and the World Bank doing things rapidly and doing things according to Latin American interests. And the last one, we need an economic development arm, which is USAID. And I have a lot of respect from people working in USAID, a lot of respect. Very smart people. But their rules belong to a reality that doesn't exist anymore. The USAID has supply-driven approach, which means I'm going to decide what are going to be the priorities. I'm going to design the programs, and I'm going to go execute in Latin America. I'm going to ask you if you agree. When the approach should be the reverse. International cooperation should go to America Latina with humility and tell them, what do you need? What is important for you? How can I help you? How can we co-design and coordinate and co-execute our programs? That is the way to it. And to finish my comments, it's I said a lot of things about China and Latin America, and I am giving concrete policy actions in order to do that. I just a couple of days, I have a very interesting private conversation with Senator Bennett, which is an incredible politician in the US, and she has a lot of initiative to do things. But here we are in a career against time. Latin America is going to a very difficult economic situation. We are getting into economic unrest that will lead to probably an economic crisis in the next years. For the first year, Eric, in the last 20 years, with the exception of the financial crisis, there are 3 countries that are going into recession in Latin America. This is the first year in which Latin American exports has decreased in comparison to the last year. And this is the first time in which Latin America is not almost growing as a whole in the region. So I believe that the situation is much worrisome, and we need to take action immediately.
Julio, thank you very, very much for those great comments. You know, I really like the way that you talked about the need to reframe the debate, with urgency, with leadership, with ambition. But, you know, China's been very effective. And I think Bethany was talking about this a little bit too, about discussing how, you know, it's all about economics and it's all about economic growth and such. But there is a totally different conversation around democracy and around development that is not being had. And I think the COVID pandemic really amplified that, where, you know, people were focusing on results of vaccines and that sort of thing, which they should. That was the crisis. But, you know, China turned that around and said, well, authoritarian countries can provide better results than democracies. Look at the democracies over here. They're not having an impact. And that's exactly the point I think you're making about, you know, lack of coordination, lack of discussion, lack of urgency, you know, 27 months for approval of projects. You can't compete against authoritarian countries, which literally can just make a decision like that and move forward. But the long-term implications are dramatic. And I really appreciate that you've brought that into the conversation. Congratulations and thank you for that. We're going to move to Mariano Federici. Again, the biographic information of all of our speakers is attached to this Zoom, or linked to this Zoom session, and we call your attention to that. Their backgrounds are extraordinarily impressive. I have not done any of them justice, but I would call their backgrounds to your attention. Mariano, you are working in the corruption space, or more accurately, the anti-corruption space, and you've seen it both from the private and public sectors. Give us a sense of, from your perspective, does the presence of authoritarian capital tend to increase or decrease corruption, or does it not really have much impact at all? Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, first, Eric, for the invitation. Thanks to the Council of the Americas. A pleasure also to be sharing this panel with such distinguished co-panelists, and congratulations, Bethany, on your book. Look, when we talk about Latin America, Eric, we're talking about a very let's say, not homogeneous region. But today, what we are seeing are some very common patterns that offer opportunities for authoritarian capital. And in particular, we're seeing a region that is very much inclined to the left, in some cases to the extreme left, with the growth of authoritarianism in the region itself, a region that was very hard hit by the pandemic. I mean, probably one of the hardest hit regions in the world by the pandemic. On average, GDPs went down 8 to 10%, and Chinese authoritarian capital has the particularity of being able to seize opportunities like this. You have a region that is desperate for capital, that has, let's say, some leniency towards financial integrity controls, and is open to enter into negotiations and deals without putting too much attention to high standards in terms of integrity. The situation of corruption in many countries of Argentina of Latin America is very serious. We have a cancer in terms of corruption in the region that explains much of the political instability and backset in terms of democracy as well. And I think all of these conditions and factors generate the opportunity that China has been seizing for the past 2 decades, at least, a little bit more than that, in its inception in the region. But the case of China's inception in the region is also, as you mentioned, Eric, a case of neglection by the U.S. and other Western democracies. This was allowed and could have been in a way controlled or managed in a different way. Look, in 2004, then President of China, Hu Jintao, mentioned in a statement that China was going to invest by the year 2010 $100 billion. He was right about that, and that generated a lot of enthusiasm in the region. He was right about it. From 2000 to 2010, if you combine foreign direct investment and trade in the region, the value of Chinese foreign investment and trade was over $180 billion. And by then, 8 of the 33 nations in Latin America had China as their main trading partner. In 2020, by 2020, the value of the combined foreign direct investment and trade has increased to $450 billion. And now 14 out of the 33 nations in the region have China as the main trading partner. So what went wrong? There is I think a need to do an autocritic, let's say, from Washington and other Western democracies about what allowed this to happen in terms of competition. Where did we fail? Where did we fail to offer the region opportunities to keep a balance in terms of trade partnerships? I think the incorporation of China into the IDB in 2008 was a major turning point as well. I'm sorry to say, it was. What was China doing by incorporating itself into the IDB as a minority, very minority shareholder under very peculiar circumstances? It was the first country that paid a fee, for instance, to become a member of the IDB. It paid a $500 million fee to become a member, which has more than recovered by now already. It was a great investment to become a member of the IDB, because what happened, and this was explained very clearly recently by former IDB president Mauricio Claver-Caron, when he described how the creation of the Special Operations Fund, which allowed for sovereign loans to be matched by Chinese loans in countries where China was investing, allowed China to grow in the penetration of its investment in the region at a very, very rapid pace. So in a way, you could say that the U.S. co-financed the inception of China into the region through the IDB. I think, there is an incorrect perception that China's investment and trade in the region is solely of an economic nature. There are still many that believe that, particularly in the region, and many in opposition governments that are challenging current socialist or authoritarian governments still believe that China, is just there to do business. What needs to be understood is that China tends to blend its strategy through what it's called, and we all know, the dual use commerce. That is the commercial, the use of commerce business for commercial and military applications. We see this in the mining, extraction, water sectors, but I want to focus on two sectors in particular. In the investments of ports, China currently controls, through Chinese state-owned companies, 40 port infrastructure projects in Latin America. 40 port infrastructure projects in Latin America. Many of the companies that are managing the port facilities in Latin America are tied to companies that also operate with the Chinese military. Peru's Chancay port, for instance, one of the major ports that are still being built in the region, controlled by the company COSCO Shipping. COSCO Shipping is a major provider of the PLA. Navy provides logistical support to the PLA. Another sector is the satellite ground stations, which, as an Argentine, we have experienced what that is like. Back in the previous Kirchner era, China entered into an agreement to build a satellite tracking station in southern Patagonia. These stations are very important in terms of, in the military world, for what is called the space situational awareness, is the ability to track the movement of satellites. So in our country, they built a satellite tracking station. It was a very untransparent arrangement. There was very little information provided to the public. There were very high suspicions of corruption having been involved in the deal. When Mauricio Macri's government came in 2015, it attempted to review the contracts. It said to the Chinese, we're going to look at all of the negotiations and deals that have been put in place. And the Chinese said, yeah, fine, no problem with that. But take a look at the contracts very carefully. Take a look at all the clauses in the contracts. And they were very serious about pointing that out, because most of the strategic infrastructure investments that China enters into have these so-called cross-default clauses that basically state that, failure to comply to complete a project accelerates the loans in all the other projects that China has invested in. So it is clear that China is pursuing a strategy here in its inception in the region, which is not only economic in nature alone. It is a military and civil state-led strategy program that basically seeks to leverage all the levers of state, military and commercial, to advance and to support the military strategy of the PLA, of the People's Liberation Army. This is written down. It's documented in Chinese documents. The military civil fusion state-led, state-directed program that seeks to leverage commerce to advance military interests. And if we don't want to see that, we don't want to acknowledge it, we are not going to be assessing the risks that Chinese inception in the region represents, and we're not going to be able to design the adequate, appropriate strategy to manage and mitigate those risks. I'll leave it there, Eric, open for questions.
Mariano, thank you very, very much. Look, that cross-default strategy is powerful, isn't it? And I'm really glad you raised that into the conversation, but you also pointed again to what other panelists have been talking about in terms of lack of transparency. We don't know what we're purchasing ultimately, and that's a real problem for democracies. We are at our time, the designated time, but I do want to see if our panelists would indulge us for a brief period of time. If those of you remember Washington television back several years ago, they had a show hosted by John McLaughlin and the McLaughlin Group. And at the end of the program, he would go around the panel for his lightning round and say, call on somebody and say, what's your final comment? I'm not going to call on people, but we have 4 tremendous experts here on the topic. And I would like to give each of you the opportunity, if you choose, to make one final comment based on the comments of the other panelists. Is there one point that's particularly sticking in your mind that you would like to leave us with? I'll ask you each to speak for no more than 2 minutes apiece, because we already are at our time, as I mentioned. But Bethany, if you're still with us and you would care to offer a 2-minute final comment, we'll give you that opportunity. And then Tuto Quiroga, Julio Guzman, and Mariano Federici. Bethany, are you still with us? Okay, we'll move to.
No, I'm here. Just a minute.
Okay.
Sorry. Got my video going.
No worries.
Hi. Yes. Thank you so much to the panelists for your. I learned so much from everything that was said. I think all I would leave us with is one thing that I felt, and I think it was addressed from many different points, is that Chinese investment and Chinese trade and Chinese capital is something that I welcome to some extent around the world. I think that when you look at, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative or the AIIB, the reason that the BRI has been so successful in gaining political capital for China is that it fulfills a need. And when people ask me, questions like, well, how can we get countries to not choose to go, with the Chinese, or to not have the Chinese build this road? I always say it's okay for Chinese companies to build roads if those roads need to be built, and if no one else can do it. But obviously all the other issues are there as well. But I am glad at a fundamental level that there is another player, offering choice to countries when they need it.
And that's the balance, right? That's the balance. That's what we've been trying to point to. I think that's exactly right. Infrastructure needs in Latin America are huge. They're huge, and China has that capability, but there's the broader implication too. And I think you've really done a good job highlighting that, and well done. Thank you very, very much. And your balancing comment is well taken. Tuto Quiroga, to you.
Thank you, Eric. Quickly, China, there's corruption in Latin America. Before China arrived, there will be, even if China stops lending, they have to do with what Julio mentioned, institutional governance issues. The word of caution that I reiterate is that China is engaging on trade agreements while US and Europe are not. And this has not come from Petro in Colombia or Lula in Brazil. It's coming from Lacalle in Uruguay and Santiago Peña in Paraguay, or it came from Lasso in Ecuador. Not that I want to change the subject, but the real threat to Latin American democracy is not from China. China bought copper from Piñera or Bachelet, or they bought coal from Uribe or oil from Chavez. The real threat is Russia and Iran, which are dictatorships. And if you just look, Eric, back at the tour of Lavrov, when he came a few months ago to Latin America, he went to Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua to tour the regimes that are, I call in Spanish, hijos de Putin, regimes that are sons of Putin, and Spanish is puncher, as you understand. And then Raisi, the Ayatollah, sent by the Ayatollah, the president, came to Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua. October 22nd, yes, Mariano, we have elections in Argentina, important first round, but within a democratic framework. We have the primaries in Venezuela with María Corina Machado. The only way to regain democracy in Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua is through María Corina Machado. And if we want to help Venezuela regain democracy, I beg the US and Europe to not disentangle from Venezuela. There's a lot of talk about lifting sanctions based on something called free and fair elections that nobody defines it. I will define it for you. Maria Corina Machado has to be allowed to run for president, and she will clean their clock. And if we want to regain democracy in Cuba, Nicaragua, let's start with Venezuela. And trust me, they are right now under the purview and being run by Russia and Iran. I call Venezuela occupied land by the sheriff, not the sheriff like American sheriff, but with a C. Cuba, Hezbollah, ELN, Russia, Iran, FARC. I've been saying it for years. Those are the real threats. China is a commodity buyer that will also buy oil from a free democratic Venezuela when Maria Corina Machado is president, if we have free and fair elections in Venezuela. Thank you.
Yeah, and we've been talking a lot about China, but the bias here is on authoritarian capital, and that clearly includes Russia and Iran and other actors. There is a differentiation there for sure, and Tuto, as usual, you've really broadened the conversation in a very productive way. So that's great, good stuff. We'll come back for another panel, perhaps on the Russia and Iranian issues. They're related but separate. But no, you're right to raise them, and I appreciate that. Julio, to you for your final comment.
Well, thank you so much. I learned a lot from all the participants, and thank you for that. My last comment should be a comment of awareness, and it's I believe that if we do not do something, Latin America is going to transit from a democratic recession that is now to a democratic depression. And why is that? It's because for the first time in 20 years, the whole region is entering into a phase of economic unrest. And that means that for the first time in 2 decades, the pocket of the people, economics, are going to be an additional factor for political unrest. And I believe that this scenario is going to create the plate served to China. And the reason is very straightforward. In order to prevent the economic crisis, most Latin American countries will need fresh cash to deal with fiscal deficit and to push public investment. And the only actor now that is ready to give fast cash, no question asked, is China. And I think that the next 4 or 5 years, if there is no action plan from Latin America and also our allies, the situation is gonna lead to a democratic recession, to a democratic depression, I say.
You've been highlighting that point for a while, and you've been really doing some important work on those issues, Julio. Congratulations, and I hope people are listening because we need to take that warning seriously. Mariano, perhaps there's a note of optimism that you can leave us with, or maybe not, but it's over to you for the final comment.
I'll start with the pessimistic to end with a more optimistic comment. But I think I like the comment that Jorge made about Russia and Iran, but I do see a connection there. And I'm not the only one, unfortunately. There are many people. I worked for many years in the intelligence community. In Argentina, I led the financial intelligence unit, but I also chair the Egmont group of financial intelligence units. That is the international body that brings them all together. And, we are seeing coordination among China, Iran, Russia. First of all, in financial matters, they gather together at the BRICS. Iran has been invited to join the BRICS as well. There are financial operations being planned among BRIC members, but there is also a pattern in terms of investment choices. Countries they focus on: Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba are all in their list, and of course that brings a whole new additional range of risks to the region in terms of national security, in terms of democratic stability, interference in democratic processes and elections, and rule of law and integrity. My word of optimism is that we're talking about this here. I want to congratulate the Council of Americas for organizing this discussion and for for allowing us to raise the voice on these issues. I know many people in the U.S. government are concerned with the risks, without leaving aside the benefits of Chinese involvement in the region, but the risks have to be assessed. And not only that, a strategy has to be deployed to be able to manage and mitigate those risks. And that demands strong leadership. So I'll leave it with that.
Well, thank you. A terrific way to end our program. Ladies and gentlemen, you've just been treated to a graduate level seminar or higher on some very cutting edge issues that are facing Latin America and the Caribbean today, as well as other emerging markets around the world. We've had 4 of the most knowledgeable and connected panelists to be able to talk about these issues. And I really want to express my personal thanks to each of you for your comments, as well as the thanks of the institution that I represent, the Council of the Americas. And I want to thank all of our meeting participants in terms of viewers for your attention as well, and hope that you'll continue to engage with us on these very important issues. They're not going to go away. We need to understand them better, and we need to be able to react in a favorable way for the benefit of the region itself. Democracy, development, and quality of life. So we thank you again, each of you, for joining us today. This will conclude our program. We hope to see you again here at the Council of the Americas in New York, Washington, or Miami, or anywhere around the hemisphere we happen to be very, very soon. Thanks again.